Okay, hello everyone, and Shua Tov. I love getting to say that before this class, kind of putting us in relation to Shabbat as we go into learning some Sugyot from Masechet Shabbat. Thank you so much, Rabbi Zuckier, for your previous two classes. Of course, this is the last of the three, which is, too bad, but tons of other classes coming up. Again, next week, Sunday, there will also be a class with Miss Sarah Zager. I'll be here for that. See you then. But yeah, so without any further ado, thank you, Rabbi Zuckier.
All right, thank you very much, Maxine. And this week's topic, technically, it will relate to Shabbat topics, but it's technically not in Tractate Shabbat, as we'll see. It's in Tractate Sanhedrin, but still touches on the resting theology as we've been discussing. So I think we're still in the clear. So the last 2 weeks, just to quickly review, we looked at two different sugyos in Klal Gadol, the seventh parak of Shabbat, seventh chapter of Tractate Shabbat, and one about what happens if you forget when Shabbos is, and different scenarios of that, and sort of how we think about that and what that tells us about how Shabbos fits in with the rest of the week. Last week we saw the question of Halakhic Bamidbar. If someone's stuck in the middle of nowhere in a deserted area, doesn't know when Shabbos is, what do you do? And touched on questions of, is Shabbos subjective or objective, meaning is there like a day of the week that is Shabbos, or is it really about when you experience Shabbos as being? Usually those two overlap, but in that interesting scenario in the desert, maybe not, and that ties into time zones and all sorts of other interesting things. Today we're going to talk less about the awareness of the person when Shabbos is, and more about the question of who keeps Shabbos, and I think and really the exclusivity of Shabbos, as we'll see from our topic on the question of a gentile observing Shabbos. So that's our plan for today, and as we'll see, there'll be a few different explanations of the reason why there's this distinction, that there's a particularly Shabbos among other mitzvos, are not really supposed to be observed by Gentiles. So we'll get into why that is, why Shabbos is different than other mitzvos, and what that tells us about Shabbos and our resting theology. So we're going to jump in now to the handout, share the screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. And, as per usual, everyone's invited to be on camera if they're so willing. Helps have some sort of connection here between us as we're learning together online, if you can. All right, so this is in the Gemara in Sanhedrin. The Gemara in Sanhedrin has a whole section, a few different dapim, where it talks about the Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach, the 7 Noachide laws, 7 laws that non-Jews are expected to keep. This is not on that list, as we'll see, but it is related because some additional laws that are not part of that sort of core of those 7 are also, tangentially related and are discussed as well. And so we're going to talk about this idea of a Nachri Sheshavas, or a Goy Sheshavas, a Gentile who kept Shabbos. Just before we get into it, just a disclaimer that this is talking about a scenario of, let's say, the standard scenario of a Gentile who's not on a conversion track or something like that. If in a case of a Gentile who is on a conversion track, that may be different in a variety of ways. And guess if it comes up, that's something to discuss with the sponsoring rabbi. But just to put that out there, we're not talking about that scenario. We're talking about sort of your standard, your standard case. I don't know how standard this is, but the theoretical standard case. So let's read the Gemara now. Amar Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish says, Nachri Sheshavas chayev misa. Very strong statement that a Gentile, and this is the text in the Vilna Shas, in the printed Gemara, but in all the manuscripts we have not Nachri but Goy meaning Gentile. At some point in the medieval and early modern period, the term Goy was seen as sort of a negative term, a derogatory term, so it was often censored out, often replaced by the word nachri. So here's an example of that. But the original word is goy. That's why if you look at all the Rishonim, they talk about goy sheshavas. That's why the Sugyot is generally known as that. But in our printed Gemara, the word nachri got it. But in any event, a Gentile who keeps Shabbos, chayiv misa, is deserving of the death penalty. It sounds very strong. Of course, as probably everyone knows, death penalty in general isn't administered. And as we'll see later, there's actually a difference between this ruling and other rulings in general, that where we say chayiv misa, in the sense that even according to many Rishonim, as we'll see, even in the time of when there was when death penalty was administered or could have been administered, it wouldn't actually be administered here. It's more of a theoretical chayiv misa, that sort of it's a sin deserving of misa rather than that punishment would actually be meted out. But we'll get to that in a bit. In any event, so there's this prohibition to keep Shabbos. What's the proof text? Shenemar v'yom v'layla lo yishbosu. The verse says, day and night they shouldn't stop, right? Yishbosu, note the root there, Shabbos, right? To stop, to rest. Day and night they shouldn't rest. Now, as we'll see in a minute, this pasuk is not really talking about people, but it's understood to extend to that. We'll see that in a minute. So you have your verse, and we've prohibited Gentiles from keeping Shabbos. So that's point number one, to prohibit it, right? Lo yishbosu, it's prohibited for a Gentile to rest and therefore to keep Shabbos. And the Amar Mar and Mr. Someone said earlier in the Gemara, we said Azhar Shalahan Zoi Misasan. Their warning is their death, meaning, in general, let's say for Jews, there's all sorts of prohibitions in the Torah. There's 365 prohibitions, and you need to specify what the punishment is in each case. Some sins are punishable by death. Some sins are punishable by kares, excision. Some are punishable by malchos, lashes. Some none of the above. Every case you need to spell it out. The default is, let's say, malchos, but you need to spell out what even that's not so clear. You need to spell out what the punishment is in each case. So that's for Jews. For Gentiles, there's a much more limited set of prohibitions, right? The 7 Noachide laws, 6 of which are standard prohibitions, and maybe a couple more like this one. The rule is Azhara Shalahen Zohi Misasan. The prohibition itself already determines the punishment, which is the death penalty, meaning all prohibitions entail the death penalty regarding Gentiles. And one of the ways of understanding this is it's a more streamlined system, right? Instead of 613 commandments, there's only 7. Instead of having a whole variety of modes of punishment for violations, there's one standard punishment, misa, the death penalty. So it is harsher, but it's a streamlined system. It's at least one way of understanding it. So you put these two things together. The verse says, lo yishbosu, not to rest, not to take Shabbos. And if it's prohibited, what level of prohibition is it? It must be a death penalty because of these two rules. So that's Reish Lakish's reasoning. So far, so good. There's the prohibition. Prohibition, the proof text, the punishment. Okay. Amar Ravina. Ravina adds on a point. He says, afilu sheni b'Shabbos, even on a Monday, right? Because we're not just talking about keeping Shabbos on Saturday, the day that Jews keep Shabbos. We're even talking about a Gentile keeping Shabbos on a Monday, right? Sort of a random day of the week. The prohibition still exists. We'll see this will tie into some of the reasons given. Presumably, it's not about the day of Shabbos per se. It's about the very fact that you're not working. That somehow is problematic. And we'll see that in a minute. And then the Gemara challenges this. It says, wait a second, but we know there's a list of 7 Noachide laws. This is not on the list, right? The Gemara discussed all 7 of them earlier. This is not on the list. So, v'lichshevei gabe sheva mitzvos. If this is actually prohibited, then it should be on the list of the 7 Noachide laws, but it's not. So there seems to be a problem here. The Gemara responds, no, ki kachashiv sheval taseh, kumase lo kachashiv. The 7 Noachide laws, all of them are passive in the sense that they're prohibitions, things you shouldn't do. So, Ever Menachai, don't eat a limb of an animal. Birchas Hashem, don't curse God. Gezel, don't steal. Avodah Zarah, don't worship idols. Gilei Arayos, don't commit sexual prohibitions. What am I missing? There's dinim, which is a bit more complicated. We'll talk about in a minute, but to have a court system, which is negative. Shvichas damim, murder, that's a big one. Shouldn't forget that, right? That's a prohibition. All these things are prohibitions, things you shouldn't do. So those all get on the list. But this isn't something you shouldn't do, if you think about it. It's really something you have to do, meaning you shouldn't not work. Well, the way of saying that in normal English is you must work. You can't take a day off, meaning you have to, every day you must work. It's an active charge. It's not telling you to be passive, not to do something. It's telling you to be active. And kumase lo kachashiv, the list of the 7 Noachide laws is only laws that are asking you not to do something, to refrain, not that are asking you to act, to work. So that's why it's not on the list. But really, that's just like a counting convention. Right? That's just, it happens to be what we put on the list is this and not that. But it's an equal. Really, there's really 8 mitzvos b'nei Noach, and this is number 8. It's just not on the list on a technicality. Okay, now just one problem with this rule. Vel dinim kum asehu. Wait a second. Dinim, the positive commandment to set up a legal system that applies to Gentiles. That would seemingly be a positive thing, something you're expected to do, not to refrain from doing. So why is it on the list? Why is dinim, setting up a court system, on the list of 7 if it's passive and v'kachashiv, right? And it's counted. So the answer is kumase vishe vel tasenenu. No, actually, dinim, there's 2 sides to it. It's both a commandment to set up a legal system and the prohibition not to allow for infractions to happen, not to allow for immorality to set in, which is what happens if you don't set up a legal system. So fine, we solve the counting convention problem, and what are we left with? This prohibition of Gentile keeps Shabbos. It's punishable by death of all things. And based on this pasuk of Yom V'Layla Lo Yishbosu, the continuation of the Gemara is really a whole interesting topic in its own right. We'll just look at a snippet of it, and it'll be interesting and maybe a little bit relevant in a minute. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said, notice Rabbi Yochanan is the Talmud Chaver, or the other way around. Rish Lakish is the Talmud Chaver. Rabbi Yochanan, they're sort of chavrusas. They learned together. They had some fierce debates together. They're frenemies in the best sense of the word. And so Rabbi Yochanan adds on, Nachrisha Osik Batorah Chayiv Misa, another sort of parallel rule that also a Gentile who studies Torah is deserving of the death penalty. Again, as the Rambam says, it's not implemented, and again with the same caveat that this is there's many exceptions to this rule and minimally applies nowadays. But at least the theory of it, he says, Shenemar Torah tziva lanu Moshe morasha kilas Yaakov, as the song goes, and the pasuk lanu morasha v'lo lahem. Right, the pasuk says Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Moses commanded us the Torah, obviously speaking for God, right? So God commanded the Torah through Moses, through Moshe. Morasha kilas Yaakov. It's a morasha. It's a heritage. Lanu morasha v'lo lahem. Right? You can't. It's our heritage. It's not their heritage. And this. I'm not going to wade into any political issues, but I'll just point out that this basically is an argument saying that cultural appropriation is, at least sometimes, inappropriate. Right? This is our heritage. This is the Jewish heritage, the Torah, and it's meant to be studied by Jews. It's not meant to be studied by others. You can, of course, join the Jewish people. There's a process of conversion, but to be an outsider and to study Torah is a form of cultural appropriation that Rabbi Yochanan says is therefore prohibited. Again, not going to get into the politics of it, of course, and there are many exceptions to this, as I said, but at least that seems to be the basic structure of the argument. And then it raises a similar question: why is it not on the list? And there's an explanation how it really is a subset of other items on the list. Maybe it's a form of stealing, which really fits well with the idea of appropriation, right? Appropriation sort of means to take something that's not yours. Or maybe it's, if we understand Morasha to be like Orasa, like the Jewish people is somehow betrothed to God. So maybe it's the equivalent of sexual impropriety, so to speak, to stand in for Israel in that relationship with God. However you understand those details, the point is it's about, at least for the Torah issue, the prohibition of studying Torah, the Gentile studying Torah, seems to be that it's supposed to be special between the Jewish people and God, and no interlopers and no appropriation of this important relationship between the Jews and God. So that's the basic Gemara that we're starting with. And as we'll see, there's a couple different directions we can take this. I intentionally didn't specify which direction to take some of these arguments in the Gemara, especially the first half, because we'll see it's a little complex. Before we get there, let's take a look at some psukim, at some of the biblical source texts that are being used here and that are not being used here, just to notice some of the interesting complications here. So first of all, remember the proof text that we saw Yom v'layla lo yishbosu, right? And day and night, they shouldn't stop. Therefore, Gentiles have to always be working. They can't take a day off of work. They have to work day and night, every day, every night. You can't take a day off. That's prohibited. Lo yishbosu, no Shabbos, no rest. So the original source for this it seems to be very far removed from our context. So let's take a look here. This is after the Mabul, the deluge, the flood, and Vayiven Noach mizbeach Hashem. Noach builds an altar, and he brings all these sacrifices. He brings the sacrifice to God. God smells the offering. This is the only place in the Torah where it says that God smells a sacrificial offering actively. God says to God's self, I won't ever again curse the land because of humanity. The human nature is evil from its youth, right? People have this evil aspect to them. Itself an interesting line. I will never again strike all living things as I did. I won't wipe out the earth like I did in the Mabul. Okay, so far that's right, makes sense. And this is still God speaking. Od kol yemei haaretz. Still continuing for as long as the earth exists. Zera v'katzir v'kor v'chom. Zera, sort of planting and harvesting and cold and hot. V'kayitz v'choref. And winter and summer or something like that. Hot season and cold season. V'yom v'layla. And day and night. Lo yishbosu. Will not stop. Now, the way this is typically understood, and you look at most of the commentaries there and they'll say this. It's saying, well, during the Mabul, during the flood, it was sort of a reset on like earth science, right? They had the earth sciences textbook. They had to rewrite it. It wasn't relevant anymore because usually, there's a rainy season and a dry season, and it's sunny and it's cold and hot. And here it just rained straight for a whole period of time, and then the whole world was just really wet. Like it messed up everything. That's what we call a climate change, I think. So that's what was going on during the Mabul, and God's saying, part of this reset, I won't destroy you. Okay, that's helpful. That's good. And we're going to go back to normal Earth biology, right? Normal, the world's going to work normally again. There's going to be seasons. There's going to be cold and hot. There's going to be day and night. Because there wasn't really day. If it's always raining, it's always dark. There's no functional day. So now lo yishbosu, it won't stop. Just like the last year has been sort of. The earth took off a year from normal functioning. Now we'll be back to normal. That's pshat. That's the simple meaning here. But obviously, the way our Gemara takes it, Yom v'layla lo yishbosu doesn't mean that the earth will go back to normal, because what does that have to do with what we're talking about? It takes it to mean Yom v'layla lo yishbosu, not that day and night won't stop, but that people won't stop for day and night. And the way we'll see this a bit inside later, but the way it's understood is, at least one way it's understood is it's a kal v'chomer. It's right, like if the expectation is, let's say, Earth's nature is to have day and night and warm season and cold season and all that, the 4 seasons, and that's what Earth is supposed to do, and that's why it better do it. God's saying, listen to me, follow the rules, Earth. So it's a kal v'chomer. All the more so, humans should have to listen to God, and if part of human nature is to work, as we know from elsewhere, Adam la'amal yulad, a person is made for toil. That's sort of human nature is to work. So it's human nature to work. You should also have to follow the laws of nature. So it doesn't spell out, and people also have to work, but it's implicit, just like nature works and has to work, is supposed to work, following God. So too, people are supposed to work as well. So that's fleshing out what we're doing with our proof text here, which is by no means obvious, but fine. But that's what the Gemara is doing. It's a bit of a stretch, but you often have these sorts of stretches, these midrashic readings, and this is a case of it. So much for this. Let's and of course always happy to take questions if people have them. If not, we'll move to the next biblical source, the next set of psukim that are a little more troubling or a little more complicated in light of what we're reading here. So this is Yeshayahu Perek Nun Vav, Isaiah 56. Which is, okay, we'll pause because I see Nathan posted a question. Just going back to the first Gemara, don't we have the aspect of don't keep Shabbat as Sheva al Taseh of Nachrish Shabbat, just like don't permit infractions? So it's a good question, meaning we define dinim the idea of setting up a legal system as both a positive and a negative command, whereas Shabbos, even though it's formulated as lo yishbosu, don't stop, is understood as a positive thing, because right, not stopping is the equivalent of saying go, of do something. But why don't we say it sort of has both sides? So I think the answer to that would be that we only have one pasuk, you only have one verse, so you sort of have to choose. Is it a positive, is it an active or a passive verse? And since in practice it means you have to work, so we take it that way. It's not clear that we're always fully consistent. I think what's his name? I'm forgetting now. Someone has an article. Aaron Shemesh has an article where he talks about the definition of aseh and lo taseh, and how different layers of rabbinic literature have different ways of defining it. So it's a complex question, and you can look there for further analysis. I don't know if he talks about this passage or not, but it'll help contextualize it. But yeah, it's a little fuzzy how you go with that. Yeah, it's literally don't rest, and it's taken to be, but we take the practical meaning, not the way it's formulated, don't rest, but practically what that means, which is act. Yeah, it's not fully smooth, but that's that. Okay, I see Shoshana put a question in the chat, and then we'll take Jake's question. Back in the first Gemara, what happens with converts? So I don't know if you were here when I mentioned this, Shoshana, but basically, in practice, the way this Gemara is applied, it's again, anyone in the situation should have a conversation with the relevant rabbinic parties, but generally it's waived to at least to a large degree is waived in the case of someone along a conversion track. Certainly studying Torah is that's even clearer that you have to teach someone Torah in order for them to convert, because they have to know what they're accepting, at least to some degree. So that certainly is waived. This one, Shabbat, there's a couple of different views on it, but often one view, basically I'll spell this out because it was asked. There's two basic views. One is that you can't fully keep Shabbat, but you do sort of one technical violation of Shabbat until the point of conversion, and then but basically you keep Shabbat other than this one thing as sort of training, and then after the conversion you can you keep Shabbat fully, obviously. The other view is that that's just a little too much to expect of someone to they're like going through the whole Shabbat keeping process and to break something. So some views allow fully keeping Shabbat if one's on a conversion track. And again, that's a conversation between the prospective convert and their rabbinic sponsor or whatnot. So yeah, there's ways of sorting that out in that context. We're going to focus on sort of the classical case, which again is probably not so common, but at least in theory, the classical case of a Gentile with no intent of conversion who just wants to keep Shabbos in one form or others. Right. And other ways, right? Keep it Saturday morning, but not Friday night. That would be another way of partially keeping Shabbat. Sure, Shoshana. Okay, and now Jake has a hand up. Jake, you're on mute.
Just a sort of syntax thing for the question of aseh or lo aseh. Maybe it's too cutie, but is the Gemara possibly saying like lo yishbosu, they shouldn't do Shabbos, like as a verb?
Great, yeah. So it might be that, and to some extent that'll depend on what exactly the Gemara is prohibiting. So hold that thought, right? Are we saying lo yishbosu means don't stop, and always work, or does it mean lo yishbosu don't keep Shabbos? One weakness of saying it means don't keep Shabbos is how do you read that in context with the rest of the pasuk? It's a little harder to make it work, but right, if you just say it's just a midrashic flourish and you're focusing on lo yishbosu, yeah, definitely that could very well be part of it. This actually ties in a little bit to Nathan's question they just put in the chat. Isn't that verse talking to all of humankind? So presumably what you would say is, sure, it's talking to all of humankind. You can't just take off a day unless you're commanded by God to keep Shabbos as a Jew, and then you can, right? So it's like an exception that's, pretty clearly, if, God says, work every day, and then he says, well, this one day, take off, it's pretty clear that supersedes the previous prohibition, right? So I think that would be the way you'd work that out for why Jews are allowed to not work on Shabbos. Any other questions on what we've done so far? Okay, so let's jump in now to Psukim from Yeshayahu. This comes up in the liturgy. This is read as the Haftarah on fast days, so stay tuned. Yeah, Yeshayahu is talking. This is right. This is the end of the Yeshayahu, part of the Nechama, the consolation, and thinking about redemption. And so here's a bit of like a positive. It's not the It's not the more lachrymose Yeshayahu of the beginning. This is more of a positive angle that we find towards the end of the Sefer. So he says, "Kol amar Hashem shemru mishpat v'asu tzedakah." Keep justice and righteousness. Redemption is coming soon. Praiseworthy is a person who does this. Right? Keep Shabbos, it's great. Shabbos is great. Okay, so far nothing controversial, nothing complicated. But then those Gentiles who are drawn to Hashem don't say, God has separated me from his nation. And the sorry, someone who's castrated or can't reproduce shouldn't say, I'm dry wood, I can't reproduce, I'm separate, I'm outside of the Jewish people. Don't say that. God says to those who are infertile, but keep Shabbos and hold on to the covenant. Okay, even though you can't reproduce, you'll have continuity. Yad Vashem, right, just like Yad Vashem, the institution, it's a way of carrying on the memory of people who no longer are living and don't have children necessarily to carry on their living. So God will give these people, for keeping the Torah, will give them a Yad Vashem, right, literally a hand and a name. But it's a way of carrying on, like a memorial, carrying on their memory. Shem olam etein lo asher lo yikares. They won't die because their name will be carried on forever. By keeping the Torah, God will give them that name, and that's a way of responding to the concern that someone won't have children, they won't have people commemorating them in the future. No, by dint of keeping the Torah, God will commemorate you automatically. That's number one, less relevant to us. But then uvnei hanechar, the Gentiles, hanilvim al Hashem l'sharso, who are drawn to God to serve God, ula'avaz shem Hashem, and to love God's name, lios lo la'avadim, to be servants of God. Okay, so good stuff for them. Kol shomer Shabbos mechalalo machzikim b'brisi. All of those who keep Shabbos, not to desecrate it, and hold on to my covenant, right? And these are Gentiles, not Jews, Gentiles who keep Shabbos. So if you ask the Gemara, okay, Gentiles who keep Shabbos, what happens to them? Bad, very bad, right? But that's not what it says here. Here it says, I'll bring them to my holy mountain, I make them happy in my house of prayer. All their offerings will be accepted, happily accepted on my altar. My house is a house of prayer for all nations. So not only can these Gentiles keep Shabbos and keep the covenant, that's a good thing, but they're also bringing sacrifices. So sounds like this is a pro-Gentiles keeping Shabbos view. It's what it sounds like. You take a straightforward reading. Clearly, that's not how Chazal take it, which is very interesting. It's also worth noting, okay, so Ozzy says must be talking about converts. That's one solution. I think on a pshat level, it's not so clear, but presumably that's how Chazal would understand it. Historically speaking, in the Second Temple period, right, following this restoration that Yeshayahu was talking about, when people start coming back to Yerushalayim, rebuilding the Beis HaMikdash, etc. So during the Second Temple period, there actually is a group that's known as the God-fearers. They're not Jews by birth. They're sort of Greek-speaking people who see Judaism as a good religion that's worth taking seriously. And you might say that they were trying to live up to what's discussed here in these psukim. So it's not just a theoretical idea of Gentiles keeping Shabbos and bringing sacrifices. There actually were groups in Bayis Sheni, in the Second Temple period, who did this. And it's interesting to see at least the pshat in Yeshayahu, which again may not be how we take that law in practice, but at least the pshat here seems to be open to that idea, whereas our Gemara seems to be opposed to it. So that's definitely worth thinking about. Definitely interesting, and makes our Gemara a little more of a chiddush, a little more of a novel point, of a surprising point. And good. So now we need to explain. Right? We've set everything up. We read our Gemara. We noted how it reads the relevant verse, and we noted how that seems to diverge from what we see in Yeshayahu and Isaiah. But now we need to figure out what's the basis of this prohibition, right? We saw this verse, day and night don't stop, and how you understand that. But really, what's the logic behind it? What's the argument behind it? So we'll start by looking at a couple of midrashim that are likely earlier than our Gemara, but may give some of the background for what our Gemara might or might not mean. And one of them stems from this pasuk. This is from Kiddush. You might know it. V'shamru v'nei Yisrael es haShabbos. right? The Israelites keep the Sabbath, to do or to perform the Sabbath for their generations, an eternal covenant. Between me, God, and between the Israelites, it is an eternal sign. It's a sign that God created the heavens and earth in 7 days, in 6 days rather, and on the seventh day, God rested and took a break. So, right, by humans taking a break on the seventh day, just like God did, we commemorate that. We discussed this the last couple weeks. So notice there's several terms here that sound sort of exclusive. Number one, bris, covenant. Right? God makes a covenant with Bnei Israel, with the Israelites, not with the other nations. Although in the source we just saw in Yeshayahu, it does talk about Gentiles holding on to the covenant. So that's a bit of a monkey wrench, but at least in general, when we think about covenant, covenant is exclusive. It's something special for the Jewish people, number one. Number two, this language of Beini, Uvein Bnei Israel, between me and the Jewish people, that sounds like a special relationship. It's a one-to-one thing, and it's Bnei Israel and not others. Again, they can join Bnei Israel and then be part of it, but if you're not part of Bnei Israel, you're not part of this special Shabbos thing. And Shabbos is Osi Leolam, right? It's an eternal sign. It's a sign of that special relationship between God and the Jewish people. So one medrash, this is Mechilta Rabbi Yishmael, a very important, one of the early Tanaitic, Halakhic, important midrashim. All midrashim are important, but some are sort of more core to rabbinic literature, and it gives a whole set of interpretations of these psukim. But we'll focus on just the underlined part here. It says, Beini uvein bnei Israel, v'lo beini uveinu osa olam, between me and the Israelites, it's a sign, but not between me and the nations of the world. They're excluded, right? And not just that, presumably you could read this as saying not just that the rest of the nations don't have Shabbos, because like every other mitzvah in the Torah, it doesn't specify this mitzvah is only for Jews, not for non-Jews, right? That's obvious. Unless you specify it is for non-Jews, you'd assume it's only for Jews. The whole Torah is only for Jews. So why are we spelling this out? Presumably, it's that it's specifically not meant for non-Jews. Gentiles should not keep Shabbos. That's the implication. Right. So that seems to be a straightforward explanation for this, right? There's some special relationship between God and the Jewish people, and for a non-Jew, again, if you're joining the Jewish people, it's a different story. But for a non-Jew to say, look, I'm not Jewish, but I can keep Shabbos just as much as any Jew, it doesn't work like that. That's actually counterproductive. You could call it a form of cultural appropriation, or we'll see in a minute. The next medrash will give a nice metaphor for how this works, and you have no basis for intervening there. I see Nathan asks the question, right? If the logic here is to commemorate that God created the earth in 6 days and rested on the seventh day, that's a universal point, right? The earth belongs to all people, right? God created the earth for all people. That's true, and yet what I think this pasuk is saying, certainly that's what the Medrash is interpreting the pasuk is saying, is that the commemoration of God's creation of the world, which the creation was universal, but the commemoration of that creation is particularistic. That's just for Jews. Only Jews have this special mission of commemorating God's creation, and that's a message for the whole world to see, but only for Jews to perform. Right? It's not obvious. And if we had another class in the series, we might talk about different universalistic and particularistic aspects of Shabbos, which we can talk about. I guess next time we do something on this. There are different aspects. Is Shabbos about creation of the world? Is Shabbos about being freed from Egypt? That seems to be more particularistic, although some of the messages there are very broad-based messages as well. But what comes out of this medrash is God created the world. God rested on the seventh day. Jews commemorate that, and that's not meant for non-Jews. It's only meant for Jews. And for a non-Jew to take that on, it's appropriation. You might say it's similar to if a non-Jew studies Torah, because Torah is meant for the Jewish people and not for others. It might be seen as a parallel idea. Shabbos is meant for the Jewish people and not for others. Okay, so that is I'll just and just to reiterate, this approach happens to be particularistic regarding Shabbos. There are certainly many other messages in Chazal about Shabbos and about other things that have a universalistic aspect to them, and we always should be aware of when one message or the other is being focused on, but both definitely play an important role in Judaism. Let's see another medrash. This is in Dvarim Rabbah, Deuteronomy Rabbah. Deuteronomy Rabbah is usually understood to have been finished and compiled at a later date, but often it includes materials that are earlier. And we'll see how we go with this. But at least there's a good argument for assuming that this is an earlier text that just gets included in Dvarim Rabbah at a later date, but may be very well Tannaitic as well. Certainly, it refers to named Tanai. And we'll see this will flesh out that idea a little bit further. So it says, V'amar Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, Ove Kochavim Sheshamar Es HaShabbos, right? A Gentile, or here an idolater, right? A worshiper of stars who keeps Shabbos. Ad Shelo Kibel Alav Es Hamila, before accepting upon himself circumcision. Okay, so this is not authoritative. This is not the Gemara, but this sounds like we're talking about someone who hasn't been circumcised, but maybe is planning on it, right? Maybe along a conversion path, possibly, but certainly they haven't been circumcised. Chayev Misa, that same line of liable for death. The Lama, why? Why is he liable? Shlo nitztavu, they weren't commanded. So if you're not commanded and you do it, then you shouldn't do it. Okay, that doesn't fully explain this. Umara Isa Lomar, Misa. Why would you say that a Gentile who keeps Shabbos gets the death penalty? Like, what's so bad about it? What's the issue here? So Amar Rav Chiya bar Abba Rabbi Yochanan, he says, Rav Chiya bar Abba says the name Rabbi Yochanan, and notice Rabbi Yochanan came up in our Gemara as explaining, as saying that a Gentile shouldn't study Torah. Now we're going to use Rabbi Yochanan also to explain the Shabbos thing. So here's this story he tells. B'noag sheba'olam, like the way things work normally in the world, melech umatrona, a king and a matron, or let's say the king's consort or wife maybe, yoshvim umasichim zemzeh, they're sitting having a conversation. So misha ba'u machnis atzmo beinehem eno chayev misa. If someone the king is having dinner with his consort, and you sort of barge in, and you're like, hey, I want to join. Is that okay, king? Right, and you just join in. So yeah, of course you're going to get chayev misa. You're going to get the death penalty for that. How dare you barge into a private conversation between a king and his consort? Right? It's just inappropriate. He's having this private dinner. You have no right to join in. Kach haShabbos hazo. Same thing for this Shabbos. Bein Yisrael uvein HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's who? Right? Shabbos is this special thing. It's like a special dinner, so to speak. Maybe dinner and then a lunch between Israel and the Jewish people. It's this special time that Klal Yisrael and Hashem have together. Shenemar, as we saw, the same verse, Beini Bein Yisrael, between me and between the Jewish people. It's this special. It doesn't spell out. It doesn't continue, but the continuation. It's an oath. It's a special sign. It's it's your special time together for the Jewish people and God. If you barge in, that's not appropriate. Any Gentile or idolater here who comes in and interlopes, right, inserts himself between God and the Jewish people, until he accepts upon himself circumcision, chayev misa, you get the death penalty for that. Now the context here, I'm not going to read the rest inside, but it's an interesting context. It's where Moshe seems to be, God says to Moshe, don't worry, I'm going to give you these, I'm going to let you capture all of the land of Israel and drive the people out. And Moshe, it sounds like Moshe is worried about something. What's Moshe worried about? And the answer is Moshe is worried that the Gentiles might keep these extra mitzvos, and they might get credit, and they might even get extra credit because they don't have to keep Shabbos like Jews have to keep Shabbos. The Gentiles are doing it of their own accord, maybe, and they get bonus points. And God says, no, you got it backwards. It's not, you don't get, a Gentile wouldn't get bonus points for keeping Shabbos optionally. It's actually bad for them to keep Shabbos. So don't worry, Moshe, it's going to work out, and the Gentiles won't get religious credit, and you'll be able to conquer the land. So that's sort of a funny context there, but it engages with our issue very directly. And again, focusing on this idea of Shabbos is this special relationship between God and the Jewish people, you have no right to jump in. Now, Moshe Halbertal has argued that, and it's an interesting argument, I'm not sure it's absolutely convincing, but it's an interesting argument, that this is meant to target the early period when there were Christians who were not Jewish, who were, not even ethnically Jewish, and they were Christians who were saying, well, we keep Shabbos too. Of course, some version of that exists still today across Christianity, the idea of Sunday being the Sabbath, although Very few Christians today don't do work on the Sabbath. Certainly not in the way that Jews don't do work on the Sabbath. But this idea of Sunday being a Sabbath might be what's targeted here. Especially if you date this source, you date this medrash to the Tannaitic period, to the first couple centuries CE. That was the time when there was this whole phenomenon of of Jewish Christians, or whatever you want to call them, that were sort of participating in Judaism, but were believed in in Jesus. And maybe this is targeting them, and maybe that's why it emphasizes Oved Kochavim, the idolaters. Maybe that's assuming that's original to the text. That'll be focusing on some improper, not just that they're genealogically Gentile instead of Jewish, but that they're actual idolaters because they're Christians. And it emphasizes Shamar es HaShabbos, to keep Shabbos, trying to keep a day of Shabbos, and maybe they would do it on Sunday or whatnot, but they have no right to keep this day of Shabbos before taking on circumcision, because we know Christians, if you look in the New Testament, they're very critical of this idea of circumcision. So maybe you had a Christian, you probably had many, who didn't want to be circumcised but did want to keep Shabbos, and this medrash is saying absolutely not, and that's totally rejected. So maybe we might be able to, as Halbertal does, we might be able to say that this is specifically rejecting Christian keeping of the Sabbath. Okay, so those are the midrashim, and they've really gone in one direction. It's about this exclusivity between God and the Jewish people. That's why Gentiles shouldn't interlope, shouldn't get in the way, shouldn't appropriate our special day, our Beinu V'Bnei Yisrael Osi L'Olam, the special sign between God and the Jewish people, and it may have a Christian context. So that's one possible explanation of this prohibition. Now we'll jump back to the Gemara and take another look at some Rishonim, but if there's questions, happy to take those now as well. Yeah. And Ozzy, your points are relevant for understanding the Rambam and Sheva Mitzvos, but less relevant for us right now. We'll see in a few minutes the Rambam on this topic. That'll be the more relevant Rambam. Okay, so go back to our Gemara, and it's interesting to note a few differences between what we just saw and our Gemara. Number one, we don't say it's an Oved Kochavim, we say it's a Nachri, or a Goy, actually, in the original text, right? It's a Gentile rather than an idolater. The problem here seems to be about just the fact that someone's not Jewish, rather than that they're a Christian or they believe in the wrong religion. That's point number one. And number two, we don't say Sheshamar es HaShabbos, who kept Shabbos. We say Sheshavas, right? This verb, who rests, who stops. So is there a difference there? Maybe. And then maybe most strikingly, there's a different proof text. There's a different Xeris HaKasuf, different verse to prove the point, right? It's not about Beinu V'Bnei Yisrael, a special relationship between God and the Jewish people. It's rather about Lo Yishbosu, right? You can't take off. Just like the seasons always need to be working, the sun, the moon, whatever else causes the seasons to shift. All of that had the wind. All of that has to work, right? No days off since the Mabul, since the flood. You have to go back to the Earth's regular working program. So same thing for humans. Humans have to work too. Now, if you're Jewish, you have you not only can take off a day, you have to take off a day. But if you don't have that excuse, you must work. So it sounds like, and we'll see Rashi says this very explicitly, it sounds like the issue here is not about interloping, being interfering between the relation between God and the Jewish people, but it's you can't not work. You have to work every day. And that's why we emphasize afilu sheni b'Shabbos. It has nothing to do with keeping the Jewish Shabbos and appropriating the Jewish Shabbos. Even a Monday, right? Like Jews have nothing special on Mondays. I mean, a little bit, but not really. Nothing much going on Mondays. You want to make your thing into a Monday? Sure. Tuesday. It's the same problem of not working. You have to work. That's part of the expectation. So Rashi spells this approach out explicitly. Rashi says, Nachri sheshavas mimalach, so a Gentile who stops their work, Yom Shalem, for a whole day, Chayiv Misa is liable for the death penalty. She never Yom Laila Yishposu, because Lo Yishposu mimalacha de'abnei Adam Namikad. Right? This idea of not stopping also applies to people. The lo tema Lo Yishposu ahach sheshes itim dekrad kai. Don't say it's only talking about those 6 times or 6 natural phenomena in the verse. Klomar lo yibatlu lo yipasku milios. Pshita. Right, that's obvious that the seasons can't stop. The pasuk comes to teach us that people also can't stop. You have to always be working. And then Rashi continues when Ravina spells out afilu sheni b'Shabbos, even a Monday is prohibited. So Rashi says lo tema shvisa the kamar Reish Lakish l'shem chova kamar. Reish Lakish, what Ravina is saying is Reish Lakish's point isn't about an obligation or a perceived obligation of Shabbos, that like they're coming up with this holiday. You have to not work this one day a week. To lo lechavein lishbos kigon b'Shabbos. It's not like we're talking about a case where someone intends to rest like Jews do on Shabbos. Shiyom shvisa Yisrael, right, which is the Jewish rest day. Oh, echad b'Shabbos sheshov simbo hanotzer, and that term was censored, but they stuck it back in, right? Or Sundays that Gentiles rest. No, we're not talking about that scenario, right, where this person wants to take off on Saturdays or Sundays for religious reasons. No, you can't, no vacations, right? So if according to this view, the Gentiles vacation plan, they sign up, they try to take vacation days. The system would say, well, it's against the Gemara and Sanhedrin. You can't take vacation days. You have to work every day, regardless of religious reasons or not, right? They just want to go. They want to go on vacation, take off, right? Sleep in a hammock all day. You can't do that. It's a day that has nothing to do with rest. It's not a special rest day, not a Jewish one, not a Christian one, nothing else. Sheni b'Shabbos Yom HaKamed Lav Bar Shvisa Naka. Right? Why Monday? Because Monday is the first day of the week that has no religious connection to it. It's not the Jews' Saturday. It's not the Christian Sunday. It's a normal day, and you can't not work for a day. That's what the pasuk is teaching us. That's what the Gemara is telling us. Who did? We could have said Tuesday, Wednesday, any day would be the same. And so that's the way Rashi takes it. This is a totally different understanding. You're not allowed to take off a day of work. You have to always be working. And it has nothing to do with religious reasons or not. It's just, the world is created for people to work, and you have no right to take off a day, again, unless you're Jewish, and then you have Shabbos, you have a good excuse. Nathan's asking an interesting question. What about Mondays? Right? What about taking off Mondays, where a Jew taking off a normal day? Presumably, you would say something like, you'd have to say something like the Torah supersedes these set of prohibitions. We do have there is a drasha sheishes yamim tavod, work for 6 days and do your work, and then stop on the seventh day. And we say that one should work for 6 days. I think that would be the determining source rather than this source. I think that's generally interpreted in a looser way, not that like 6 days you must work, absolutely must work, but rather, it's like it's encouraged to work, but it's less of a hard obligation. So I think this would be a scenario where there was sort of an update for Jews, a patch for Jews that ends up slightly different, and this prohibition wouldn't apply per se, even though the proof text, as you're noting, the proof text is really lo yishbosu, that would seem to apply to the whole world and to all of nature and to Jews, but presumably that would be superseded. Okay, Ozzy asks an interesting question of how we would define this. Do we go by day, or do we go do we go like Halakhic time, where night and then day is the day, or do we go by secular time or whatever else, where the morning you start in the morning and then you go to the night? It's an interesting question, and it might depend on our question, right? If the point is appropriating Shabbos, maybe that's only if it's like a Halakhic day. Whereas if it's about just not working for a day, maybe on that scenario, the night would follow the day. It's an interesting suggestion. You'd have to wonder what Rashi would say in that case. I could see it going either way potentially. Okay, so that's this other view. We have a second view. So is this prohibition about sort of taking away, appropriating the Jewish day of rest, or is it just you have to always work? You have no right not to work for a day. And in the Rambam, we'll see it'll look like one of these views, but it'll actually be subtly, importantly different. So let's look at the Rambam here in Hilchos Melachim, where the Rambam in Hilchos Melachim has the Shevet Tzvei Noach. He talks about the Noachide laws in his Laws of Kings, which is interesting because it's part of his sort of theory of Jewish sovereignty. Right? If Jews are in control, they can set up a system where, among other things, Gentiles follow the 7 Noachide laws. That's why it's in Hilchos Melachim. And he says, Akum, and this should probably also be Goy or something like that. I didn't check the manuscripts, but almost certainly. Gaisha Ose Asak B'Torah Chayev Misa. So this is the second half of the Gemara. Gentile who studies Torah is liable for the death penalty. Lo Yasok El B'Shiva Mitzvot Shalahen Bilvad. They shouldn't study like Torah writ large. They should study the Torah pertaining to the 7 Noachide laws. Right? That's what applies to them. So they have what to focus on. There's what to study without getting into the rest of the Torah. V'chein, similarly, Akum Sheshavas Afil B'Yom Mimos Hachol. Similarly, a Gentile who rests even on a weekday, o asa'uhu la'atzmo, kemo Shabbos, chayiv misa. Im asa'uhu, right? Im asa'uhu la'atzmo, kemo Shabbos, chayiv misa. If he makes it for himself like Shabbos, if he sets up a day, he says, Mondays is my religious holiday. Mondays, that's, we worship the moon on Mondays or whatever. That's actually the original etymology of Monday. We worship the moon on Monday. We don't work. Chayiv misa. You get the death penalty for that. The Ein Tzarach Lomar Im Asa Moed La'atzmo. Well, obviously, if he sets up a holiday, right, it doesn't need to be a day of the week. It can also be like, December 25th. We worship some pagan god who gives us presents or something like that. And you set up some holiday, that would also be prohibited, right? And therefore, we wouldn't work. That would be similarly prohibited of this idea of Gaisha Shavas Klolo Shel Davar. We don't allow Gentiles to come up, to make up a new religion. To make up new commandments for themselves, out of their own mind. They just make up. Ella, you have some options. Oh yeah, Ger Tzedek, v'kabel kol mitzvos. You can convert and keep the whole Torah. That's an option. Oh Yama b'Toraso, or you can keep your own Torah, meaning the 7 Noachide laws. Below Yosef, below Yigra. You can't add, you can't subtract. Now, some of you may notice that term. It follows the language in Sefer Dvarim, the book of Deuteronomy, where it says that Jews are not allowed to add on mitzvos and are not allowed to subtract mitzvos. You have your 613 mitzvos, take it or leave it, or more accurately, take it. Gentiles have their 7 mitzvos, so they have the option to upgrade, so to speak, or I don't know if it's an upgrade or not, but to take on more mitzvos to do 613, or they can keep their 7. But you can't make up your own system. You can't be like, okay, 7 mitzvos, but also I like Tuesdays, and we're going to make that a weekly holiday. You can't do that. You can't add on to the Torah. You can't subtract from the Torah. So that's what the Rambam is prohibiting here. It's a different approach entirely. It's not that by making Tuesday a holiday, you're somehow intervening, you're interloping God's relationship with Israel. Not really, okay, because they'll do it and you do your thing. That's not the issue. And it's not that you're not working per se. Rambam doesn't really seem to care if you're just a lazy person, or you go on vacation once in a while and you don't work. That's not an issue. The issue is imasa uhu la'atzmo kmo Shabbos. If you make your own holiday, a weekly holiday, a seasonal holiday, if you make up your own holiday, that's the problem. And because you're adding on to the Torah. The Torah says you have these 7 Noachide laws. You can opt into the whole Torah. Those are your options. There's no option for making up your own system. So it's really a different approach entirely. Let's continue here. Bim asak b'Torah. If you do study Torah, o Shabbos, so you keep Shabbos, o chidesh davar, or you come up with a new holiday, which the Rambam is basically the same point, right? You keep Shabbos by making up a holiday. This person, again, in a scenario where there's Jewish authority and they have punishments of this sort, they would be physically punished. So you tell this person, this is liable for death. You don't actually kill him. So this is the view I was referring to before, the Rambam's view, which is authoritative here, that it's theoretically liable for the death penalty, but that's never actually imposed. Even in a scenario where, in a Jewish society where they would have power to, which is interesting that that's the case here. And then just for contrast purposes, he says, Ben Noach sheratza lasos mitzvah, mishar mitzvah Torah, k'tila kabel schar. A Gentile who wants to keep an extra mitzvah of the 613 to get reward for it, right? Like bonus. You don't have to keep, shatnas. But the Gentile says, I want to keep shatnas, I feel like it. We don't stop them from doing that. It's not so bad. They can keep extra mitzvahs and get some bonus points. It doesn't seem like he's too excited about it, but you're not making something up. You can bring a carbon and it's accepted. You give tzedakah, it's accepted. There are all sorts of mitzvahs you can do. These, it sounds like, and we have a whole process for them. And then he talks about what you do with the tzedakah. We'll leave that on the side. But for the Rambam here, we have an entirely different approach. The Rambam here, it's not about intervening between God and Israel. It's not about being lazy, as opposed to working what you're supposed to do. It's specifically about making up your own religion. So there's some interesting theories. Again, Halbertal has a theory about this one that, it's similar to the Almohad approach, where, they said, here's what you have to do. If you want, you can become a Muslim. You don't have that many options, and there's no real religious freedom. We sort of have a monopoly. The government has a monopoly on religious options, that they tell the people you keep A or B, but that's it. You can't come up with your own thing. And maybe that's what's influencing him. I don't know. It might be that. I'm not fully convinced by that, but it's an interesting theory. Let's see. With our remaining time, let's let's just take a quick peek at the Beis HaBechira, the Meiri, who's actually a student of the Rambam. He goes on and focuses for a while. He says there's this issue about coming up with their own holiday. The problem is likba yom chag la'atzmo lishbos bo mitoras chag. Right. The problem is coming up with a holiday, Monday, Tuesday, whatever day of the week it is, to come up with a their own holiday, not from God, not from Torah, but their own holiday to rest on. That's the problem. Why? Why is that a problem? If a Gentile keeps Shabbos convincingly enough, all the Jews will be like, hey, look, this fellow, this person is keeping Shabbos. They must be Jewish. Let me emulate them in every way. And then, of course, this person isn't keeping the Torah because they're not Jewish. They're not even trying to keep the Torah. And people will learn all sorts of incorrect things. So the Meiri sort of diverts the Rambam. It sounded like the Rambam was on principle. There's an issue with making up new religions. Judaism has a monopoly on what you tell the people, keep your Sheva mitzvos, keep 613. You can't make up new stuff. That's what the Rambam sounds like he's saying as a principle. The Meiri says, well, we're not really worried about that. We're worried it might lead to something bad, right? It's not problematic in itself. The only issue with a Gentile keeping Shabbos is the Jews will see them. They'll say, oh, this person's very frum. Let me follow them in all other ways. And it turns out the person doesn't keep halacha at all. They just happen to keep Shabbos because, on a whim, they keep Shabbos. So the Meiri sort of, even though he's a student of the Rambam, here he takes the Rambam and sort of undermines it or goes in a different direction. I thought that was an interesting angle to take here as well. Just to step back and look at sort of the trajectory, possibly, these things are a little bit reconstructed and may or may not be fully accurate, but at least one way of looking at the trajectory of the views here, and then we'll take questions, is, there, in Bayis Sheni, in the Second Temple period, there were many people, many Gentiles who actually kept Shabbos, as the Zuckier and Yeshayahu seem to imply, and as we have other records of. And, maybe that wasn't frowned upon by everyone. Chazal will certainly frown upon it, but maybe that at some point in history, that wasn't necessarily frowned upon. Then we have in the Tannaitic period, let's say the Midrashim that we saw, where because, whether because of this or just in a scenario where there were many Christians who were keeping Shabbos but weren't circumcised, were sort of coming up with their own religion, then there was this very strong approach saying, absolutely not, do not keep Shabbos. Shabbos is for the Jews, it's not for the Christians, and you have no right to interlope. By the time you get to the Bavli, it seems like, as Rashi notes, Pshat in the Bavli it's not like that. It seems to be a machlokas between the Bavli and those Midrashim. For the Bavli, it's not about having a set day of Shabbos and like competing with Judaism. It's the fact that you're not working, Shabbos, you're resting. And it's not specifically idolaters or Christians, it's any Gentile who rests, they're not fulfilling Yom V'Layla Lo Yishbosu. They're not fulfilling the idea of working that's expected by the Torah. It's nothing to do with bris, covenant, or osi, a sign, or beinu b'nei Yisrael, between God and the Jewish people. Nothing to do with that. Just you're supposed to always work. And then the Rambam, and that's why it applies any day of the week, because it's not about making a holiday for yourself. The Rambam goes back to this idea of making it into a holiday, but not because it's competition with Judaism. He doesn't seem to be worried about that at all, but because of Baal Tosef, because a Gentile is supposed to keep the 7 Noachide laws, or they can convert and opt into more, but you can't pick and choose. You can't say, I'm going to add this one mitzvah. I'm going to come up with my own holiday. There's no right to do that because Judaism, in a scenario where Judaism sort of runs the society, Judaism has a monopoly on the options. You can do Sheva mitzvos, no more, no less. You can do 613 if you convert, but you can't make up your own holidays. And that's what the Rambam seems to focus on, even as the Meiri seems to back off of this principle against coming up with holidays. For the Meiri, it's more just this technical worry that people will follow the actions of this Gentile, even though they shouldn't. But we see here a wide range of views in understanding this Gemara of Goysha Shavas, Chayiv Misa. And again, as we said, the Misa, the actual punishment, doesn't really seem to apply, but at least in theory, it's it seems to be it's presented as a severe sin, but with a wide range of reasons as to why that may be. So happy to take some questions here, and happy to take some questions. And either way, this was a nice, I think, a nice travel through 3 different sugyas. We spent a lot of time inside, which is always nice, and got to some larger theological questions as well across the board here. I see there's a question. Rambam rejects shituf for Gentiles. I assume by shituf you mean the idea of well, shita can mean a couple different things, but I assume you mean by shita the idea of having a multiple Godhead, and that being a problem or not being a problem. Yeah, I mean, it seems like most Rishonim believe that having a multiple Godhead, like, you have the real God and you have a couple of plus ones, that would be idolatry. That would presumably be the Rambam's view as well, but I'm not sure how that ties in here. Alana, I don't know if you want to elaborate on your question. And if not Alana, others are also welcome to ask if they have other questions. I know we're a bit over time. All right. Well, okay, Jake. Yeah.
Maybe Halbertal specifically talks about this, but is there any reason the Gemara, like the Rambam, wanted to codify this because he was doing so in a very practical way, and the Midrash may have had an agenda against sort of proto-Christians, but why is the Gemara preoccupied with this? It's not going to mete out this punishment in any way.
Yes, you're asking from a historical perspective, why is the Gemara so concerned with this? I think I don't think Halbertal talks about it much there, but I think you might say you have these midrashim that talk about this prohibition. You're not going to ignore it. You have to explain it. But that's why it's specifically explained the way the Gemara thinks about it. It's like, it doesn't seem like, what's this competition idea? That doesn't seem right. And that's what the Gemara says. Reish Lakish says it must be because of the lack of work. Yom v'layla lo yishbosu. So it's more like you have this tradition, you have this prohibition. How do you explain it in the absence of a strong polemical context? It seems like less mistaber, so to speak. It seems less convincing to explain it based on this idea of competition. And instead, Reish Lakish suggests that it's based on the idea of just not working.
Cool.
Okay. More questions or comments in the chat? Okay, right. Okay, so Alana's clarified her question, meaning the issue of right, can a Gentile be part of an organized religion while keeping the Sheva mitzvahs? You keep the 7 Noachide laws, and you have these other mitzvahs that you keep. So it's not fully clear what the Rama thinks about having other mitzvahs in general. He doesn't really spell that out explicitly. He does talk about Baal Tosef and Baal Tigra not adding or subtracting, but maybe he doesn't mean that in so specific of a sense. Certainly coming up with your own holidays would be a problem. So it would sound like the Rama would say, if you're part of it, you're a Gentile. You keep the 7 Noachide laws, that's great. But you also are part of an organized religion that has holidays on which you don't work. The Rambam would say that's a real problem. So yeah, it does sound like the Rambam has a real problem there, even though others don't, right? This is the Rambam's idea. Again, idolatry is a problem according to everyone. But if you have this other religion that has nothing to do with idolatry, you worship single God, but you make up your own holidays, that's what the Rambam was talking about. The Rambam thinks that's prohibited. And even Chayiv Misa is severely prohibited, but others would likely not say that. Yeah, that's a fair point. Federal holidays, that's an interesting question. I think federal holidays don't present themselves as religious, at least in the United States. Europe may be more complicated, right? It's where a lot of the federal holidays are sort of institutionalized Christianity. In the United States, federal holidays are almost by definition secular. So yeah, but in any event, that would only be prohibited for Gentiles. That wouldn't prohibit, there'd be other issues with a Jew keeping a religious holiday, but it wouldn't be this one for the reason we discussed before, that this pasuk, even if it generally applies to all humanity, it in halakhically only applies to Gentiles. But I guess if a Gentile asked the Shaila about taking off on federal holidays, that would be an interesting question. I guess I'm sure someone wrote about it in some sefer somewhere, but I don't know if we need to solve that problem here. Again, thank you everyone for the comments. Any final questions? And if not, thank you all for learning together this series, and looking forward to learning together in the future. And Maxine.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rabbi Zuckier, and thank you everyone for joining us. Again, I really do hope there is a next time. As you said at one point earlier, there are so many kind of different directions we can go with this, and some of us did get a taste of that last summer, and it was really great to return to these Sugyot again, some new things. So yeah, looking forward to next time. Thank you so much.